Retrospective. And so I'm going to do that now. Uh, and I don't have slides for this part, so I'm going to be talking somewhat ad lib here, just reflecting on what we saw yesterday. So um, yesterday involved a variety of impressions and experiences, as well as uh, coverage of sort of preformed material and discussion. The the arc of my comments that were prepared concerned the challenges of complex systems, some of the features that give rise to properties of complex systems, things like lock-in effects, things like path dependence, things like the pervasive impacts of an attempt to intervene in the system has ripple through effects in many places. The long delays seen in those effects, the counterintuitive behavior that can arise from interactions of feedbacks. These are all properties of complex systems that complicate our ability to understand, to anticipate, and to effectively control those complex systems or manage them. And that poses great problems in the context of societal challenges, which involve complex problems, because it makes it difficult for us to learn about these systems, to coordinate effectively. It makes it challenging to improve those systems, intervene on the systems, and design better such systems. And all too often, it leads to policy resistance, cases where our best laid policies are delayed or the effects are delayed or defeated by these natures of complex systems. And it leads us to work against the nature of things. I gave the example of King Canute, trying to order back the tide. And it took many centuries before scientists realized that this broader enterprise of reductionist attempts to understand things had its limits. It has great advantages, but it has its limits in terms of our understanding of how the different pieces work together to yield behaviors of the whole system that are very different from the behaviors of any one piece, just as the cycles in an ecosystem, between lynxes and hares, or coyotes and gophers, or what have you, are very different from the patterns that would occur for if you were to study each species in isolation, or the patterns we see with traffic jams are just very different from what you would understand if you knew a lot about vehicles individually. There are phenomena at a higher level that cannot be reduced to the individual subparts, just like the effects of herd immunity is not something which comes up when you study medical science and the physiology that underlies, homeostasis in our bodily functions and in disease. There are these higher level phenomena, and they are writ large across the most gnarly of society and indeed global problems. In some cases, it's also layered in with issues of choice of values. So when it comes to issues involving climate change, or when it comes to issues involving the concerns about hate speech and disinformation and online misogyny, there's inevitably some discussion that occurs also on the value front that distinguishes not only as a complex system, but a wicked problem, as it's often called. Now, fortunately, although the the heavy emphasis on reductive science had its limits in understanding these systems. If you combine it with, link it up to system science or complexity science, the science of the whole, we're learning scientifically and in terms of management skills informed by that science to better understand, better anticipate, better head off problems with complex systems. And you see this in the small and in the large. You see it in the small and diverse fields of study where tools are brought forward to help us manage matters of great complexity, whether it's logistics and planning for businesses, whether it's managing software project complexity and the complex systems that are there, or project management and construction and numerous other areas. We've developed tools informed by complexity science to help us better manage these situations. And these tools in system science complexity help us better understand, help us better anticipate, head off problems, not run into problems quite as readily in managing complex systems. And I will note, with an eye towards the interest here on the broader linkages between dynamic modeling, agent-based modeling as an example, and data science, big data, AI, machine learning, I will note that the toolbox of complexity science and system science is considerably broader than simulation modeling. Certainly, simulation modeling has the primacy of place in this context, in that it's the most prominent and certainly the most widely used tool from that important toolbox of complexity science. But in those other contexts, when we join system science with data science, for example, we will often dig deeper into that toolbox and make use of other tools. The use of state space reconstruction through Taken's embedding theorem being an example, recognizing causality within empirical systems, using that toolbox can help with causal discovery in a dynamic context. And there are a set of tools from that toolbox that can help us reason about systems near a critical point, where they may be near a tipping point, for example, as occurs with herd immunity, where if you have enough immunized, large enough fraction of the population immunized, the number of infections, the infections won't be able to spread effectively in the community, even though at an individual level, there'll be still some susceptibles that could get infected. At a societal level, at this higher level, the emergent pattern level, the infection can't spread. Or it peters out very quickly, more technically. And here, this broader toolbox from complexity science, joined with other areas of mathematics, such as topology, bring us this wealth of tools, provide insights on systems, the underlying structure over which they evolve, the so-called manifolds over which they evolve, lies at the heart of some of the most innovative and interesting methods, in my mind, within the data science context, such as topological data analysis with the UMAP protocol that UGA is working with, for example, our stalwart TA. So here, modeling is a very important tool from that toolbox, but we should recognize that there's a broader set, and many of those other sets are really equipped to deal with this relating of complex systems, dynamical systems, to the evidence we have about them, and rigorously learning using data about complexity despite the presence of these hallmarks, perhaps most notably the effects of nonlinearity within these systems. So in this context, these tools coming out of system science or complexity science can better equip us to deal with these challenges of complexity. And where the human brain, our natural wetware, falls grievously short in managing even descriptively simple, dynamically complex systems, many experiments to demonstrate this, were terrible at managing these systems, equipped by proper tools and simulation being prize among them, we can do much better, and we can shield ourselves from blowback that might otherwise befall us with naive approaches. There's a fascinating literature for anyone who's interested, demonstrating the quite striking, to some shocking, limits on human reasoning and human capability unassisted within the context of these descriptively simple but dynamically complex systems. And the system dynamics literature has some wonderful experimental work in this. John Sterman has run experiments, as have others, that have demonstrated how, even the most highly trained, mathematically rigorously equipped science, students in the STEM areas, who have deep knowledge of the mathematics involved, just fail terribly poorly. They fare terribly poorly in managing even very modest complex systems, unassisted. But equipped with the right tools, we can do better. And dynamic modeling tools are tools that help us do better, but they help us do better not in a way that we offload our thinking to them, that we turn to them to replace our reasoning. Far from it. They help us sharpen our reasoning and help us be more savvy, help us head off cases where we're broadsided by the side effects of our interventions unwittingly. And they can help us learn more effectively, learn to better check our cherished prejudices, and better understand through rigorous study what's likely driving certain patterns in a system, and how that might be affected by the impacts of choices that we have. So these dynamic models can help us in several ways. And we saw, both in my comments in the morning, but through the day, later, with some example models as well, and then with a model we were building up, there's several different levels at which having recourse to models help us learn more effectively, help us think. One of them is surprisingly modest, yet surprisingly powerful. It's to help us reason about, reflect on, share understanding of, share perceptions of um, and welcome challenges to our understanding of the structure of the system. So when I say structure, you may recall that we were building up models yesterday, much of them together, which had uh, a, a structure expressed uh, using some mechanisms of agent-based modeling. The main one that to which I drew repeated attention was, of course, the use of state charts. And a state chart captures structure in terms of the evolution of a system, the states it can be in, the possible actions that can change those states as recognized by these transitions, and indeed the rules that govern those actions as indicated by these little icons, with some being triggered by arrival of a message, some being triggered as a certain rate over time, a hazard rate, to use language of biostatistics and survival analysis, or a timeout or an agent arrival at some destination. So having recourse to an ability to sort of draw out structure sharpens our thinking. It takes ideas that are inchoate in our head and forces us to try to structure them in a way that is coherent and sensible, and more carefully thought through. And that itself, even if we're just doing it by ourselves, that's an important process. But when we bring others into the conversation, it's vastly more powerful yet, because we can bring their perspective, we can bring their lived experience, we can bring their perceptions, and they may challenge our representation. They may bring alternative proposals for a representation. They may refine it, and they may suggest things. And that by itself, as I say, is an important step. And one thing that's fascinating about the literature on these things, and I credit Peter Hoffman for for highlighting for me some of the work in the literature, although the work of the Albany School with David Anderson and George Richardson and others has also, and Etienne Rouet in Netherlands, has also been helpful for showing just how much engaging with these models, the structure of them, does sharpen thinking, and how these diagrams, and this is an important point, are not merely sort of attempts futilely to sort of share perspective between different people. They can actually facilitate conversation otherwise, compared to what otherwise would be possible. So I recognize that, for you, this is a new language for many of you, but studies have shown that properly introduced, these sorts of diagrams can serve as what's called boundary objects between people from very different backgrounds. And far from just serving as a sort of crude attempt to point at things and draw people's attention, to try to stir up discussion between different members, it can actually facilitate discussion by having a common point of focus between, as it's written, the social spaces of these different individuals. And although I may speak, the language of, let's say, a infectious disease physician, and you may speak the language of a social worker, and someone else speaks the language of an epidemiologist, and someone else yet, a person living with HIV/AIDS, who is living without regular shelter. Even though we come from diverse backgrounds, we have very different vocabularies, very different concepts that we deal with day to day. By having something in common we can point to, we can actually eke out some degree of better communication than would otherwise be the case. It's a bit like if you travel to a foreign country before the era of, Google Translate or what have you, and you want to try to communicate with someone, you may use pointing, deixis, pointing at things to try to better communicate what you're referring to. Pointing at diagrams, for example, can help set up some common points of understanding that even though my words, my language is very different than yours, we have some degree of communicating around the diagram. And that's surprising to me, but powerful finding. And our work with participatory modeling has suggested that there's a lot there. There's a lot of reason to believe this is indeed the case. So models, dynamic models, confer value as constructs by simply, serving as a shared space where we could take our different perspectives and where we can discuss, challenge, refine, critique, improve, innovate, be inspired by, and create other diagrams from one another. When these diagrams have extra structure, when they have clear meaning associated with them, clear mathematical semantics associated with them, like is the case with state charts or stock and flow diagrams, including with system structure diagrams, even without formulas, or like causal loop diagrams and their ilk. These carry particular value for learning and for gaining some high-level understanding from it. You can get more out than you put in, as it were, in terms of emergent features that you didn't build in directly, but which come out of it. And the example I gave, modest though it is understanding the feedback loop structure from a causal loop diagram. And we'll be talking about that later in this bootcamp as we introduce other methods. But it's something you can come away with from a causal loop diagram, even though no one of the pieces you put in there, contain that feedback loop structure. It emerges from the composition of the arrows that are there. So these diagrams are powerful communication tools, particularly in an interdisciplinary level, in their own right. But what we saw yesterday is they serve as more than that, don't they? They serve to enact theory. And if we take it another level further, such that we pin down the meaning of some of these transitions more specifically, we give, for example, these rates particular numeric values associated with them, say of rate of recovery of 0.1 per day, meaning that on average they'll spend 10 days in this infective state before leaving, or that they leave home after a certain amount of time here, 14 hours. If we start to pin down the specifics of this and the meaning of this enough that it becomes unambiguous, it becomes precise enough, then we can ask what its logical implications are in terms of behavior over time. And we saw that was the process of simulation. And that process can give us findings from the model that, I think can be mistakenly treated as just like, regarded as just like, okay, the output from an input-output system. But it's more than that. It provides insights for Okay, TAs, please watch people needing to be admitted here. It provides an avenue for learning from this model, because we may see emergent behavior coming out of it, which is contrary to our experience, or the experience contrary to the experience of system stakeholders or people with lived experience. And I want to highlight that for agent-based modeling in particular, this opportunity is particularly large and rich. I say that because the types of patterns that can come out of an agent-based model in comparison to an aggregate model can capture very readily a broader set of types of experiences to which a system stakeholder, a person with lived experience, might relate. Maybe it has to do with their history over time, their exposure to different spheres of activity, or different spheres of life of various sorts. And I will note that in this context, agent-based models can readily create these sort of biographies of individuals that show their history across many different areas. And I'm just going to put down a little example of this here. I hadn't planned on this, but such is the nature of these sorts of retrospectives. So this is, a person's history in our polysubstance use model, for example, as it comes to, their experience with chronic pain, or their economic circumstances, whether they're working or part-time or full-time, etc. The degree to which they have contact with community-based organizations, or engaging in substance use or acquisition of substances from fentanyl. And we can capture their sort of timeline, or their history, across these areas, and across areas such as incarceration or contact with police, for example, in a way that helps us better depict their life experiences in a way that someone with lived experience might be able to relate, to which they might be able to relate, might be able to challenge, might recognize, and help refine. And that can come out of an agent-based model, this sort of person's history, in a way that it can't out of an aggregate model. An aggregate model might keep track of, has the person ever overdosed before, yes or no. But really, if you want to capture someone's history of exposures, or of experiences of incarcerations and contacts with the police, or their uses of substances, or their experience of chronic pain, or their experience with adverse childhood experiences, or traumatic incidents, that's not in general going to be possible unless you have an individual level representation. But another one from our interactions, or our use, participatory interactions of using models with people with lived experience, has to do with an agent-based model depicting network structure, and talking about their experiences of stigmatization, for example, and contact with physicians, and how that might lead to cutting off opportunities for further care seeking with that same physician. And these discussions can get going over networks, because networks are things to which people with lived experience can relate. They have social networks, they have family networks, they have, co-use networks potentially. They have relationships with shelters or with community-based organizations. And these are things to which they can relate in an agent-based model, given the ability to capture network structure. similarly, geographic information. They might be able to relate to model hotspot depictions about where people spend their time, and they could challenge or falsify or help improve. So models are these learning tools, and effective visualization, sort of sharing outputs from the model. It's not a matter of just getting reports of the model findings, nor is it merely a matter of eye candy of putting up there pretty, visualizations. It addresses the heart of what we seek to do with models, which is to learn and to be vulnerable to challenges that can help us learn more effectively. And I argued yesterday from this seat that models help us fail early, fail often. They help us towards that observation of Francis Bacon that we can learn more, we can arrive at truth more quickly through error than from confusion, by trying something and learning from that experience. They help us test our own understanding in a way that is more rigorous by subjecting it, testing it in the crucible of its logical consistency over time, and asking if we describe it in a model, does it add up in a way that, so to speak, to what we see from the world? Does it give rise to behavior similar to what we speak to the world? And so this ability of agent-based models to have a broader repertoire of outputs and to visualize that in various ways is actually quite core to this task. Whether it's creating timelines or visualizations of social spaces and, in a geographic context, and identifying hotspots, or doing network visualizations, showing networks changing over time in the context of stigmatization or what have you. These are powerful tools to help us in this broader enterprise of learning that lies at the heart, in my view, of effective modeling. So that's just a little bit on agent-based models' role beyond what we covered yesterday. I did emphasize, for reasons both sociologic, with the human theater of modeling, and having to with our ability to learn along the way, to sharpen our understanding and make more savvy decisions as to modeling priorities, and in order to head off problems with our models, to recognize issues with our models. The imperative of having iteration in our modeling, step-by-step modeling, going from milestone to milestone, making very few changes each time, observing the results of those changes, testing it for plausibility and consistency, being on the lookout for any anomalous behaviors that might suggest a problem with our model, but also interesting emergent behaviors from which we might want to learn. This is how we maximize learning. And rather than rather than making great the enemy of good by aiming at a big, better, beautiful model later, and just working towards it by building up the model, you need to constantly be testing that model, building that model. I said yesterday, build early, build often, and need to be running it. My colleague Jeff McDonald talks about you always want a model to be 30 minutes from being able to be runnable. And I think it's a good rule of thumb. I've never regretted applying that goal. And I think if you can keep a model in a form that it can be run, or let me put it this way, if you don't, you're going to shortchange your ability to learn from it, because it's by simulating it that we often learn where it falls short, where it's not capturing dynamics, where it's not able to be true to our experience or the experience of our stakeholders. I have lectures on this subject of the imperative of iterating, the many virtues of iterating, and giving advice there. At this point, I think I'm going to probably just post those as slides for inspection. But as with any materials, if you want to hear more about it, I'm glad to give lectures on this subject, and you'll find lectures by me online on this subject as well. So right now I'm putting into our lecture slides some slides on that subject, which I wanted to share with you. It's called Overview of the Modeling Process. And if anyone's interested in me talking more about it, I'd be absolutely delighted to do it. And it is something I think is one of the most important components of practical modeling, is guidelines on using model purpose to simplify models, building up the model bit by bit, and building up stakeholder confidence bit by bit, building up understanding bit by bit, building up confidence in the implementation of the model bit by bit. And building up our sense of what data is relevant to the model, what empirical evidence is relevant to the model. And I want to start with that. I want to finish with that relationship between models and data that I emphasized yesterday, because it's been a central theme of the feedback from the survey, and it's going to be a central theme in this boot camp, like few other such ABM boot camps. I spoke yesterday about this relationship between models and data, and dynamic models and empirical data from the world. And I emphasized a few points on that. And I'm going to reemphasize them today in these remarks, keeping them brief. So one thing I said, which is perhaps a wee bit contentious to some outside the system science area, would be using Plato's analogy of the cave, and that from a system science perspective, the patterns that we see in data tell us something, but they don't tell us the truth about the situation. They whisper to us about some underlying situation, but we have to recognize that they come with their limitations. They're often incomplete. They're sometimes inconsistent. Sometimes they're entered through a process that is unreliable. They will often have equity issues associated with them. And I use the analogy of shadows on the wall because they are not the truth. They are a kind of reflection of patterns in the system, or here shadows cast by structures in the system, but they are not the underlying situation. And I argued that system science, complexity science, always beckons us to understand better the underlying system. This is true of simulation modeling approaches. I will note that it's also true, per my comments earlier, of a growing number of machine learning approaches. And these approaches seek to reason, for example, about the underlying manifold that that is underlying data that we observe from the world. Often a manifold associated, this low dimensional surface associated with the evolution of a system underneath it that's giving rise to this data. So topological data analysis methods I mentioned a few minutes ago, with UMAP being an example, but other temporal topological data analysis methods that are advanced and use Haken's embedding theorem are of similar character. And here we're cluing into the underlying system that's giving rise to the data. And yesterday I showed another graphic that, we have this underlying system, this external world out there that is evolving over time, that is complex, that's predominantly unmeasured. And we have measurements from it. If I could use more of an engineering or scientific term, we have empirical observations from it. If I could use a term that might be more familiar in the social sciences and health sciences. But those measurements have the shortcomings I noted earlier, and they are very incomplete. They are, just taking place on little bits of the system. And then what we observe often is associations. And so much of health sciences traditionally have focused on those associations and looking at important associations between risk factors and outcomes and so on. And those studies, those associational studies, can provide some important findings, but they are almost always grievously hampered by the fact that they are dealing with associations rather than directly looking at the causal structure of the system. They are also looking at associations that are contingent upon the data generating process and the underlying dynamics of this system. And given, I argued, the occurrence of an intervention or the occurrence of some change in the underlying system involving, an economic downturn or a new regulation or new types of treatment or therapy or vaccination, et cetera, some sort of innovation, some sort of technological change, those associations will change. And what we're trying to do here with system science is characterize the dynamics of this underlying system. And we can simulate this data coming out of the system. Indeed, we did that yesterday. And we did it in these models that, we were exploring here. These are observations coming out of a simulated underlying system. And we can look at the associations between those at an individual level or a higher level. And perform statistics on those, et cetera, and relate those to the world. But in a way that recognizes that if we intervene, those associations will be very different. So here, the observed data has value. It can help us cross-check our assumptions about our model. If our model is producing outcomes that are contrary to experience of people in the system, it's probably, and it's an empirically grounded model that we're seeking to relate to some particular context, we probably want to improve that model. But often models are geared towards looking forward with questions by answering counterfactuals, situations that have not been observed, where there is no data because they haven't been in place. What would the effects of introduction of vaccination be for COVID in our province? That's what we were one of the things we were looking at within our province. What would the effects of a fall 2021 new introduction of lockdown be? TAs, please be sure to admit people faster than I am. what would the effects be of a change in contact tracing policy, upstaffing contract tracing more fully? These are all issues that we're running for the province during my secondment. And they were dealing fundamentally with counterfactuals where we don't have observations in place for that data generating process. And here we are, I use the analogy going off track. We're going off road. Far from going around in a racetrack circle where the past is a pretty good judge to the future, and where we can train machine learning models on the patterns of the past to do comparatively well in the future. Things don't change much. We are going in a direction where there is no data and where we can't rely on those patterns, those associations that are at the heart of statistical methods traditionally, and the heart of many machine learning methods traditionally, deep learning on down. We're not going to be able to rely on those patterns still holding. This is a theme that will continue in our various models that we build. It's also a theme that I'll be expanding in more depth in some lectures on the systems data science enterprise, and how these tools, these growing number of tools from data science that help us peer into an underlying system, its underlying manifold, the structure of that manifold, do state space reconstruction, estimate the causal, the impact of the causal relationships, whether it's A to B or B to A or reciprocal or absent of both, with both being driven by another variable. These are things we're going to be able to talk about in the context of systems data science methods that draw on these advances both in system science and in data science cognate to that. So anyway, those are some comments on our material from yesterday. I think I'll stop my